In their search for a utopia, the Soviet leaders had tried to plan and control everything, but this had led them into tyranny and dictatorship. What Buchanan argued was that all politicians followed their self-interest, because the idea that they could interpret and express the general will of the people was logically impossible. Behind this view lay not just right-wing ideology, but a scientific theory called game theory. Game theory had been developed as a way of mathematically analysing poker games. It looked at the game as a system where the players are locked together, each trying to work out what the other thinks they will do. From that, game theory showed rationally what the best moves were for each of the players. Individuals lived their lives as a game in which they pursued only their own self-interest, constantly adjusting to each other's strategies. If this were true, the economists argued, then the very idea of the collective people's will was mathematically impossible. You simply cannot add up the millions of competing individual desires into one coherent goal. They called it the impossibility theorem. And the only system, they said, that could respond to what people really wanted in such an atomized world was the free market, not politics.
In this game theory view of the world, everyone is out for their own personal advantage, and then if you take that as given, then all those individuals want to maximize their pleasure in this very simplified scheme. And that's what the impossibility theorem says. It says they actually do that in the market, but they don't do that in political situations like voting situations.
It's a very narrow view of politics.
Very narrow view of politics, but of course it has to be because it's a narrow view of the human being. But what it does is it reduces what it means to be a human being to a few relatively mechanical principles.
Underlying game theory was a dark vision of human beings who were driven only by self-interest, constantly distrustful of those around them.
They are seeking separate optimization, just like poker players.
Is each player alone?
That's the idea, that they are alone, they're separate.
By the early 90s, this argument had come to dominate not just economics, but also the thinking of those who ran the markets. In 1992, Walter Wriston, the head of Citicorp, the largest bank in the world, wrote a bestseller called The Twilight of Sovereignty. In it, he predicted the coming triumph of a new market democracy, where the market would take over the responsibility for running much of society from the politicians. Markets, he said, are the only true voting machines. If they are left untouched by politicians and regulation, they will truly come to act out the people's will.
Alan Greenspan communicated a very clear message to Bill Clinton that the economy and people's appetites as expressed in the economy, their buying, their ability to buy, what they prefer, is a better gauge of public sentiment than any other. The economy, to that extent, is superior to democracy. In a democracy, it's less tidy. People can express their preferences only indirectly through their representatives, and their representatives have to express the preferences of a lot of people, and sometimes want to express their own preferences rather than their constituents. So in that way of viewing the world, an economy is preferable to a democracy.
Faced with the bankers' argument, Clinton agreed, and on taking office began to cut back on his reforms. During his first term, he dismantled much of the welfare structure that had been put in place in the 1930s. He abandoned all his healthcare reforms and cut government regulations.
The era of big government is over.
It was the triumph of market democracy, a belief that anyone who gave the public what they wanted was democratic and thus good, as opposed to the old political elites who believed that they knew what was best for us and imposed their idea of what society should be. In the process, businessmen became transformed. They might be greedy and selfish, but they were also engineers of a new kind of freedom. By responding to the needs and desires of individuals, they were interpreting the will of the people in a way that politicians couldn't.
If markets are in fact democracy, if markets are a means of consent, a medium of consent, which all these people believe that they are. There's a very, very commonplace view in the United States these days. In fact, this is a consensus view. It's hard to find someone at the upper reaches of broadcasting, journalism, business, whatever, who doesn't think this. If markets, in fact, are a medium of consent, then you've got all sorts of funny things that come out. Then CEOs, are the people who the markets have chosen above all others, are in fact men of the people. They're not some kind of bloodthirsty robber baron like Americans thought they were in the 1930s. When they speak to us, they say, "You speak, we listen."
The promoters of this idea of market democracy portrayed it as a glorious return to a golden age, a time in the 18th and 19th centuries when laissez-faire capitalism, not politics, had ordered society. But this was a myth. The political philosophers of that time had made a distinction between the self-interest of the marketplace and other areas of social and political life that involved what Adam Smith called moral sentiments. These were sympathy and understanding for others, which were just as important in the ordering of society. What was happening at the end of the 20th century was something that had never been tried before. The idea of democracy was being taken over by a simplified economic model of human beings. And in the process, freedom was redefined to mean nothing more than the ability of individuals to get whatever they wanted.
If you go back to the 18th and 19th centuries, most political philosophers and most economists understood that there was a social contract. People were bound together, not as individuals expressing themselves only through the marketplace, but as citizens. We had obligations to one another. We were not simply self-interested individuals purchasing things for ourselves, but we were a community. Our very identities, our moral values, came from our relationships in these communities. The view that the market was preferable to politics as a means of giving people exactly what they wanted. That notion is a rather new idea.
It's the idea of a human being sitting alone in a room, being able to totally reconstruct their opponent. Their opponent is totally implacable, totally hostile, and bent on their destruction.
But there was a small problem with Nash's equations. They didn't seem to correlate with how human beings actually behave towards each other in the real world. When the Prisoner's Dilemma game was tested out on the secretaries of the Rand Corporation, none of them played the rational strategy. Instead of betraying each other, they always trusted each other and decided to cooperate.
Human behavior is not entirely motivated by self-interest of each pure human.
But the underlying assumption of game theory is that it is.
Game theory works in terms of self-interest, but it was like the viewpoint that some game theory concepts could be unsound. There's overdependence on rationality. That is my enlightenment.
And Nash is not alone. A new discipline called behavioral economics has been studying whether people really do behave as the simplified model says they do. Their studies show that only two groups in society actually behave in a rational, self-interested way in all experimental situations. One is economists themselves. The other is psychopaths.
Is that all there is? Is that all there is?
But it's understood not to be a cooperative ideal.